All right, this is Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is all about forestry. Here are some of our essential questions for this chapter. So the case study for this unit is all about certified sustainable paper products. The Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, certification ensures that sustainable practices are being used for forest products. So, for example, your APES textbook is an FSC certified product, so you can feel good reading it. Haha. Forests cover about 31% of the earth, and they exist in many different biomes, and they don't always look like what you think of when you think of a forest in your head. Forests provide us with a wide variety of ecosystem services, including cultural benefits, which benefit humans directly, regulating, which help to make the ecosystem function better, things like soil erosion or stabilizing soil and preventing erosion, slowing runoff, storing carbon, that's a really important one. Supporting, meaning that they're providing habitat for many organisms, and provisioning, providing services directly to humans, such as lumber, paper, and tree food products. So, carbon storage is a key ecosystem service, especially as we're struggling with climate change. Trees store carbon dioxide, so cutting forests worsens climate change. Preserving forests allows them to store carbon. And I like this little diagram because it kind of shows the net flow of carbon in and out of the tree. I know it's kind of small, but it's a cool diagram. Some of the prime logging locations are boreal forests of Canada and Russia, and the rainforests of Brazil and Indonesia, and the conifer forests of the US. Originally, the eastern forests of the US were forested, and now the focus is on the western coniferous forests. Deforestation is driven by the demand for wood and wood products. It changes landscapes, reduces biodiversity, worsens climate change, and disrupts ecosystem services. Rapid deforestation is happening in developing countries where there are few logging restrictions. When a company pays a country for logging rights, this is called a concession. The benefits to the country are few and short-lived because the company takes the resources. They may hire people temporarily, but then they move on and go to another country to do damage there. Deforestation directly changes the way of life for indigenous people who still depend upon the forest, such as the ones pictured here living in Malaysia. Borneo is another country that's really suffered from deforestation, especially because of the palm oil industry. Native forests are cleared for palm oil plantations, which decreases biodiversity, and orangutan populations have really been hit hard. I have a fellow APES teacher friend who actually has gone and spent her summers working in orangutan refuges in Borneo. Most of the snack items that you eat feature palm oil because it provides kind of a cheap fat feel to the product. It makes your mouth feel satisfied. So next time you grab a snack, check the label, and it's pretty certain that most of your snacks will contain palm oil. And you can see some of those products in this picture. And if you pay attention to current events, it's kind of interesting. In the last few weeks, there's been a movement, some pushback from some young Girl Scouts to expose that child labor is used in the palm oil industry. And palm oil is a key ingredient in many of the Girl Scout cookies. So I'm going to post a link on Google Classroom if you want to read up more about that. Add these to your notes, as this is from the new course description and it's not in the textbook. These are some things that we can do every day to mitigate deforestation, and that includes reforestation. So whenever trees are cleared, replant them. Using and buying wood that's harvested by ecologically sustainable forest techniques, such as your textbook. And reusing wood or repurposing wood. And these photos feature repurposed wood used for furniture, home decor, and jewelry. And one of my friends had a husband who worked in a company where they built drums out of exotic woods, and he would take the scraps and create jewelry and sell them on Etsy, which was really cool. Forestry is forest management, figuring out how to balance the demand for forest products with the preservation of the ecosystem. Sustainable management is the best approach. Foresters and other resource managers often strive to find what they call the maximum sustainable yield. This is the most resources that can be extracted without depleting the forest. For trees, this is typically at an intermediate size, so when they're half grown. This graph is kind of showing you what maximum sustainable yield looks like. However, this still impacts an ecosystem because the trees are never really allowed to grow to maximum size in areas managed with this technique. Some organisms, such as large raptors like owls and some large mammals, depend on old growth trees for habitat. So maximum sustainable yield approach reduces their chances of surviving in those areas. Add this to your notes as well. One of the keys to sustainable forestry is being able to protect your forest from pathogens and insects. And the best approach is using an IPM or integrated pest management approach and removing affected trees. We talked about IPM in our ag unit. Remember, that's starting with the least damaging or the most conservative things, such as biocontrol, and then only moving toward chemical pesticides as needed. A little history about our country's forestry practices. The eastern forests were depleted early on, like I mentioned before, and this led to concern about protecting what was left and the creation of the National Forest System to manage the remaining forest lands. Now, the U.S. Forest Service is still in the timber industry, but they are about management of those forests. So this map is pretty interesting, showing that the majority of our western forests are managed by the government. Not always managed well, but they're managed by our government. Timber comes from both public and private lands, and unfortunately, public forests are often deforested at the expense of taxpayers. So our tax money pays for roads, for private industry to go in and remove that timber. One of the most damaging forestry practices is clear cutting. This is economically advantageous. It's very cheap, but it leads to soil erosion and flooding, and it contributes directly to climate change because we no longer have carbon storage in the trees that were once there. Fire policy has been in the news a lot in the past few years with the raging wildfires out west and in Australia. Historically, fires were suppressed in the U.S. If you ever have seen the Smokey Bear shirt, Smokey Bear campaign was really big when I was a little girl. We thought forest fires were always bad, but now we know that suppressing fires leads to a buildup of kindling and the outbreak of larger, more damaging fires. Many people who live near forests are opposed to strategic burning, so it just makes the problem worse the longer they wait to do the strategic burning. Prescribed fires are often needed to mimic natural events, which would happen because of things like lightning strikes. They help clear brush, nourish soil, and encourage new vegetation growth. In fact, some particular plants must have fire for germination of their seeds. So this is a cool little former APES moment. This is Kennedy Dold, one of my former APES students. And she was supposed to start her master's work in archaeology this year, but she took a gap year and she's been working as a crew leader through AmeriCorps in the Ozarks, leading a crew of 10 people on prescribed burns and habitat restoration, which is really cool. Shout out to former APES student here. So climate change is not only worsened by deforestation, it's also affecting forests directly, increasing likelihood of pest outbreaks and mega fires. And if you've ever traveled in Colorado, you've probably seen some of the damage done by the different pine beetles and boring beetles that have sort of ravaged the Colorado mountainsides. Those are going to get worse with climate change. So back to our case study, sustainable forest certification is one way you as a consumer can choose wisely when purchasing timber or wood products. Look for the stamp that you see here. It's not a great picture, but look at it. Or look for the logo, especially when you're buying wood at a place like Home Depot. So we've talked a little bit about habitat fragmentation already, but we're going to circle back and talk about it in the context of forests. Most forest species have been threatened by fragmentation, but in particular, deep wood species, such as the one pictured on the right, called the wood thrush, has really been affected heavily. And there have been many studies to show the impact of deforestation and fragmentation upon this species. When forests are fragmented, this leads to what we call the edge effect. Some species cannot live near an edge as it makes them more vulnerable to predators, parasites, and invasive species. So this is a major factor in the decline of songbirds in the US. And one of the predators / invasive species, I guess they're technically native, but the cowbird is a species that really preys on those deep interior forest birds when edges are created. They don't make their own nests, they lay their eggs in other birds' nests and make them do the hard work of raising their babies. So that's had a huge impact on our songbirds. We can apply what we know about islands and speciation to patches of forest. This is what we call island biogeography theory. So imagine for a minute that those little patches of forest are like islands out in the ocean. And we have theory that we can use to model the effects of the size of the island or the distance of the island from what we would consider the mainland. This is called the area effect. So here's some of the kind of the rules that govern island biogeography. The farther the island is from the mainland, the fewer species will reach it and colonize it. Larger islands are bigger targets, so they're going to have more species arriving. And they'll have lower extinction rates because more space allows for larger populations, and larger populations are not as vulnerable to extinction. We can also use the species area curve to predict the biodiversity of an island based on its size. And I've done some work with this myself when I was in grad school, and it's really cool how well it can predict the population of a particular group of organisms based on the size of the islands. So it's really helpful in conservation because then we can make decisions about how to prioritize fragmented patches in a forest landscape. Many choices must be made in conservation. And one thing that we consider is called the SLOSS dilemma. SLOSS stands for single, large, or several small. And so using this idea, we have to decide, do we protect a single large patch or do we protect several small patches? We only have so much money and so many resources to protect things and to do our conservation work. So there's never one right answer. It depends on what species you're thinking about protecting. But another thing you can think about is the establishment of corridors, which we talked about with mountain lions and other large mammals, to allow them to move between patches. And that connects them, it gives them safe pathways, and allows gene flow between the populations as well. So in conclusion, we must consider many factors when we think about preserving forests and managing forest resources wisely. We must also use the knowledge of island biogeography theory to help us make wise conservation decisions.